My name is Bill Blunden, and I cause trouble, and I'm here to talk about anti-forensics and how it relates to rootkits. I'm going to start off with a couple of introductory comments that will provide some motivation, and then I'm going to go through a survey of tactics and counter-tactics with some attention given to memory-resident rootkits and BIOS-based rootkits, and then follow up, kind of end things out with some logistical concerns and maybe provide some insights in terms of where I think things are headed. One of the basic issues with forensic live response is that a rootkit that's installed can interfere with the data collection process. And so what are some examples of that? Well, my favorite is probably, this is something that not many people know about. It was published in the IEEE Spectrum Online. The article was called The Athens Affair, and it was about a rootkit that was discovered by some technicians in 2005 at Ericsson, who discovered a rootkit which had been installed on a series of switches that were owned by Vodafone Greece. This rootkit worked, it was in memory, and it patched the existing system so that any indication was concealed. The command that listed executing blocks in memory was modified so that they would skip the rootkit code. It had an in-memory database to avoid audit logging, and it somehow subverted the integrity checking software. The software would every so often produce checksums to make sure everything was okay. It subverted that too. So in general, vendors like to kind of downplay, especially the software vendors who sell forensic stuff, like to downplay the possibility of a rootkit interfering with the data collection process. It's not necessarily something they want to do to say, okay, well, our incident response suite works great as long as there's not a rootkit installed. So as an example, there's a company that sells a live disk imaging package. And they had the following to say about the likelihood of a rootkit interfering with the process of live imaging. It's something like, this undertaking would not be a trivial task, even for the most accomplished kernel mode rootkit author. Well, sure enough, in 2006, Darren Bilby comes out with a rootkit that does just that. It's a filter driver, and it intercepts low-level IOPs coming up through the stack and filters out the sectors containing the rootkit. And so in response, the vendors were like, okay, fine, here's something we'll do. We'll sidestep the operating system entirely. We'll go right to the hardware and collect our data there. And that was kind of the basis for a whole bunch of hardware-based RAM capturing tools. I think Komoku came out with one called Copilot. So the idea was, okay, we can't necessarily trust the operating system. The system calls are like the OS commons. The rootkit can use them to subvert any program that's using them, and by the same token, if the rootkit's using these common APIs, they can also be used to detect the rootkit. So both sides have tried to basically avoid using system calls. And so this hardware-based approach was basically a play on that. And so they said, like, okay, we can have hardware-based RAM capturing. And sure enough, Johanna Rutkowska comes out with a presentation where she shows how you can fiddle with the map tables on the North Bridge and interfere with this process. So even if you're sidestepping the operating system entirely, there's no guarantee that a rootkit still won't be able to somehow subvert the process. So one alternative to live response where this rootkit can interfere with your data collection is to say, okay, let's put it in a situation where it can't interfere. All right, so fine. If it's feasible, and this isn't always the case due to legal issues and financial reasons and service level agreements, but if it's feasible, you can sometimes power down a machine and take the disk storage offline and do an analysis there. So if given that the investigator is looking for a rootkit, they'll follow these basic dance steps. The first thing they'll do is they'll duplicate storage, and then they'll recover as many files out of the storage as they can. They'll They'll recover files, they'll try to carve out deleted files, they'll look at slack space if they can. There's a whole bunch of stuff. They'll basically try to maximize their data set. They want as many files and snippets and parts of files as they can collect so that they have a higher probability of capturing something valuable. Once they have this pile of files, they'll do a metadata snapshot so that they can do some sort of cross-time diff in an effort to eliminate known good and bad files. And once they've kind of weeded out the known good and bad files, what they're left with is a bunch of unknown files. And this is what they'll kind of focus on, because this is what will really be suspicious to them. So once they have these unknown files, they'll then, they'll do signature analysis because they're looking for executables. If the rootkit is going to launch itself, it's naked, it's going to launch. You want to find there'll be executable content, and so you'll scan it. There's signature scanning software, and once you've found these executables, you can analyze them with static and runtime analysis. So anyone who's played chess knows that it's dangerous to underestimate your opponent. And in the past, a lot of anti-forensic treatments have kind of, dismissed the investigator as being stupid. And I don't think that's the case anymore. If you ever sat in on any of the Mandiant, presentations, you'll understand that. So for the sake of keeping things interesting, let's assume that we have a defender who knows what they're doing and knows how to do their job and is good at it. They're dedicated, and they have the mandate to do what they need to do. These are the sort of guys who will buy a used hard drive off of eBay and on the weekend see what they can carve out of it just for fun. So in this kind of high security environment, it's not unheard of for forensics to be done preemptively. In other words, you assume compromise. You assume that there's somebody there. You don't need an overt indication that there's somebody there. Okay, fine, let's assume there might be somebody there. Let's do forensics preemptively and see if we're right or not. So when you're faced with a determined opponent like this, you're an intruder, and you want to basically hedge your bet and protect yourself. There's strategies that you can kind of bring to bear. And you do this all in an effort to buy time. This is a battle of attrition. Everyone's got a budget, right? So, even the high-end people with a lot of money, they have a budget, they have a limit. So you need to buy time. And you can do this by destroying as much evidence as you can, data source elimination, data destruction. And the data that you do leave behind, you want to make it difficult to identify and locate, and even more difficult to interpret. So that would be data concealment and data transformation. And finally, along the way, you want to put up as many barriers as you can, false trails and dead ends to kind of frustrate them. And that would be data fabrication. Naturally, you want to use defense in depth. You want to use a combination of these tactics. You want them to kind of reinforce each other. And again, this is all about buying time. And a great way to do that is to use custom tool sets. Like there was a presentation a couple days ago, Metasploit Autopsy, where they had this forensic tool where you could basically recreate a Metasploit session. And that tool depends entirely upon the nuances and the foibles of the Metasploit suite. So using a custom tool, you're going to force the guy then to go back and have to see if they can, understand whatever you were doing. And if you're using a custom tool, it's harder for them to do that because now you're using something which isn't a publicly known framework. And there's just that much less information about it. Whoops. Okay, so now we'll look at tactics and counter-tactics. So in the old days, one way to avoid being captured as part of a disk image was to put yourself in a place where the imaging software is not going to find you. And in the old days, the host protected area and disk device configuration overlays used to be a place where you could hide, because if the investigator was being sloppy or they're using old tools, or maybe they couldn't afford good tools or whatever, and the tools wouldn't detect or wouldn't be able to access these regions. Unfortunately, most of the standard software today will detect and access these regions. So this is basically one place where the software vendors have done a good job, and they basically put the kibosh in our little hiding space. So again, once they've got the image, they want to recover as many files as they can, right? That's their goal. We want a big data set. And so one way you can kind of spoil their fun is you can enable disk encryption so that when they power the machine off, the volume is encrypted. And it's harder to get, it's junk if they don't have a key especially. And there are also file system attacks. You can sabotage the structure of the file system to make it more difficult. But I think both of these attacks are too conspicuous. They're noisy. They're overt. Remember, we're assuming they're doing a preemptive analysis. They don't know if there's anything wrong, and so if they see something like this, they're going to know something's wrong, and it's going to be a tip-off. You want them to think there's nothing wrong at all. Their system is fine. Their system's perfect. There's nothing wrong. Go back to sleep. So I think it's a little more subtle to rely on concealment. If you want to prevent file recovery, it's a better idea to hide your files. Naturally, this is a short-term strategy. It always has been. But again, this is all about buying time. So there was a framework that was presented back in 2006 at Black Hat Federal by Irby Thompson and Matthew Monroe when they presented their FragFS rootkit. And I think this is a really handy kind of way of categorizing and understanding concealment. The idea is that there are basically three ways you can hide data on a disk. You can use in-band concealment, you can use out-of-band concealment, or application level concealment. So with in-band, you're using spaces which are described by the file system itself. You're finding little nooks and crannies that are specified by the file system specification. Now there have been implementations, with like Data Mule FS, which is the Grugs. But in summary, the strengths of this technique are also its weaknesses. You have these little inconspicuous spots where you can stick stuff. Unfortunately, you end up having to manage a whole bunch of small little inconspicuous spaces. And that can be a real pain, especially in an environment which isn't very forgiving. If you make one little mistake and you screw up the file system, it might generate an error or cause the operating system to check the file system. You'll get someone's attention, and remember, that's not something that you want. You don't want to get someone's attention. So if you're in the Windows universe, the target of choice for in-band concealment is a master file table. And it's just a repository. It's the database that stores all the metadata for the file system, and it's just a contiguous series of records. And usually each file and directory will have one record. And if you have the time, if you have the money and the legitimacy in the eyes of Microsoft, you could probably actually look at the source code for the file system manager and also all the data structures that are used. I think Microsoft has something called the Shared Source Initiative, and if you have the money or the institutional legitimacy, you can partner with Microsoft and take a look at the source code and actually see how things work. Unfortunately, for the rest of us, that's not the case, and we have to end up having to go with open source stuff like the Linux NTFS project, which is an astounding feat of differential analysis, where they basically took the disk and started making modifications and cranked up a hex editor and saw what kind of things got changed, and did it again and again and again until they were able to reverse engineer most of the file system. At Black Hat Federal, like I said, the framework that Irby Thompson and Matthew Monroe presented was in the context to present FragFS. What it did was it used the master file table. It used both in-band and out-of-band storage space to kind of provide a hiding spot for an internal file system which was encrypted. And it was really neat implementation. So out-of-band concealment. Out-of-band concealment uses that regions of the disk that aren't accounted for by the file system. They aren't a part of the definition of the file system. Again, the strength of this method is its curse, in that the file system doesn't know anything about this storage space. So what that means is that the file system doesn't know it's there, and therefore it can just it might at any time overwrite anything you have in slack space. Not to mention that there's always those paranoid administrators who will preemptively wipe their slack space just for this very reason, that someone might be using it. So they might wipe the partition slack space, they might wipe file slack space, and there's tools to do that. The Metasploit project came out with a whole bunch of anti-forensic tools a couple years ago. There's one called Slacker, which basically, the beauty of this tool is it uses a high-level API to do some low-level manipulation, which you otherwise might be difficult to do. So you have this, you set the file pointer to the logical end of the file, and then you write whatever data you want to the disk. And then when you're done, you reset the file pointer to the logical end of the file, and you do so non-destructively. And so the key to this technique is the set end of file call, the last one, because it allows you to set the file pointer back to the logical end of file without destroying anything. And this is kind of a technically sweet kind of approach, because, like I said, you're using high-level APIs. You're just using the Win32 API to do all this. So sure enough, Microsoft kind of realized its error. What happened was they changed the API. So initially, set end of file was a non-destructive truncation. And now they re-implement it for Vista, and when you use it, it will zero out slack space when it returns. So this doesn't necessarily mean we're out of the game, but what it means is that now we have to probably end up doing raw manipulation for the file system. So we have to go into kernel mode, and we have to access disk sectors individually and manipulate them. And so it's a little more difficult. So you could solve the problem by writing a kernel mode driver that would take the slack space, organize it into a file system, and then kind of manage that on behalf of whatever other components want to use that driver. One thing I would recommend, though, if you're going to take that approach, is to make sure you encrypt your file system, because the investigator might very well be looking through slack space, and if they start seeing file system like fat table and stuff like that, it's going to be a tip-off. So application layer concealment is basically in-band concealment on a different level of granularity. Basically, like with in-band, you're finding these little nooks and crannies, but instead of in the file system, you're looking within a specific application. Obviously, you don't want to, it's a bad idea to hide data in a static file, especially if you got a lot to hide, because it'll stand out. You know, it's better, you know, if they do a binary diff and the static file is changed size, that's a dead giveaway. So what you want to do, one alternative is to find a file that changes normally, that changes, you know, as a part of its normal design. It changes by design as a part of normal operation. So this way, when you add data to it or you're hiding stuff, it's not necessarily attracting attention. So the problem with that is, though, that the file is active like that, you have to worry about, you know, your data being overwritten. So that's kind of like a context-sensitive problem that you know, the registry is like one alternative. I could think about manipulating the registry. The problem with that is you'd be using, if you did manipulate the registry, you'd be using a standard API, and that could be audited, logged, and it'd be detected. And you have to go around that then, and that would really be a challenge, I think. So again, they're going to try to maximize their data set, right? Because they want as many files as they can, and so they'll try to recover deleted files. They'll go through empty space on the drive, and they'll try to carve data out of that, right? So what do? Okay, well, there's been a whole bunch of work on wiping files, the body of the file, and the metadata that's in the file system, and that can work, but it's an awful lot of work, and it differs. You know, the details are different for every file system. And like I said, you're working in an environment where one misstep is probably going to get the attention of the system administrator or the investigator. So I think that a much more elegant and direct and kind of universal solution to that problem is just to encrypt everything before it hits the disk. So rather than having to go through all the steps of finding this data and wiping it, just before it hits the disk, make sure it's encrypted. So that's kind of, I think, a more direct route. Once you destroy the key, the data is just junk, and it can't be, if you're using a strong crypto algorithm, it can't be recovered in any reasonable amount of time. Like I said, this is all about buying time. So if you're going to use, if you're going to use cryptography, then you got to protect the key. So how do you protect the key? What are things you need to keep in mind? Well, first of all, don't store the key on disk. If you're going to store it on disk, protect it with another key. And if this malware sometime, if your package somehow gets captured, you want to minimize the amount of time that you have this key in memory, because they're going to crank up a debugger or a memory analyzer, and they're going to look at what you have in memory, and they're going to try to find that key. So try to minimize the window. You might have to utilize obfuscation and misdirection. And also you want to make sure the key doesn't end up in a page file. So you can lock memory to kind of make sure that it doesn't end up on disk, but at the same time, that locking is kind of a telltale hallmark, so you have to, again, be careful. So once they've got the accumulation of files, they're going to take a metadata snapshot of it. And they're going to perform a cross-time diff, and they're going to do that in an effort to kind of identify known good files, known bad files, so that they can isolate the unknown files. And so one way to kind of undermine that process is, one way you could just go through the file system and alter a whole bunch of files, just edit the binary so the checksums don't match. But again, you don't want you don't want to garner any attention. So you're assuming a preemptive analysis. They're assuming an incident hasn't occurred. They're just looking for suspicious stuff. So that's not necessarily a good technique. I think it's a little too conspicuous, a little too noisy. But another thing you can do is you can alter timestamps. That's like one metadata thing you can alter that's useful because it prevents the investigator from developing a timeline of how things unfolded. You can move things so that you can, see when a user logged in, when they logged out, and then do whatever you wanted to do. If you want to, set somebody up or cast suspicion on somebody else, you can do that by looking and manipulating timestamp information. Again, I'm going to go back. I got a couple other. Okay, yeah. If you're on NTFS. There's two file attributes that have time values in them. There's the standard information attribute and there's the file name attribute. The standard information attribute can be manipulated through the Windows API. The file name attribute has temporal values which are typically set when a file is created or when it's moved or when it's renamed. So it's not enough just to modify the temporal values in the standard information. You also have to worry about the file name information. And again, Metasploit to the rescue. They came out with a tool called timestamp, which allowed you to modify the temporal values in the standard information attribute. And you did that by taking this file basic information structure, which has a big data structure with a whole bunch of fields in it. And they have these 64-bit time values that you can modify and then feed that into the ZW set information file system call. And you can alter the timestamp of a file, but this is the timestamp again in the standard information attribute. I've seen workarounds which have suggested that you move a file and then move it back so you can adjust the temporal values in the file name attribute. And I've seen other people who have recommended that you directly alter the MFT itself to manipulate what's in the file name attribute. So we do this cross-time diff, and the idea is that if you had the foresight to create a baseline, you're going to be able to find out which files belong and which files don't. And once they've eliminated these known good and bad files, they have these unknown files. So how do you make that process difficult? Well, there's one thing called a pre-image attack, where you take a known binary that has a known signature, and then you alter it. And once you make that alteration, it's bad. The checksum's not going to match. So you keep modifying it until the checksum matches again. And there have been pre-images attack, I think, for MD5. But the problem with this approach is that if the investigator is really, really devoted and they have the resources, the computing horsepower, and the time, they could do a binary diff on all the files. And that would definitely, you would be able to isolate modification, right? If there's been a file modified, even if the checksum's matched, you do a binary diff, and you're going to find out if they've modified it or not. I'm kind of iffy on that, on pre-images hack. Injecting known good and bad files, that's another thing that's going to catch attention. It's more like a technique for muddying water. You know, if you know you're going to leave, and you've collected, you've exfiltrated the data you wanted to take away, and you're pretty much done. One thing you can do to kind of make it more difficult for the investigator is to, add a bunch of known good files, so they, maybe files that they don't have the checksum for, and they have to go out and search for those files and get the checksums, and again, you're buying time. Another way is to cast suspicion on something else. In other words, get a known bad file, which might mislead them. If imagine someone who's on a budget and they're looking for the cause of a problem. They have a backlog of machines that they've got to look at, and they need an explanation. It's like a cop who comes on a murder scene and who has this whole backlog of cases. And he looks at this murder and he says, man, this looks like a suicide, right? So you could use the same reasoning. Someone who's overworked and doesn't have a lot of resources and who's looking for a reason as to what might cause this, you could prematurely lead them to a false conclusion by injecting a known bad file, maybe encrypting it until an opportune moment, and then decrypting it, and then bugging out from the machine and leaving, and just letting them find that and hopefully leading them to a false conclusion. So file signature analysis. Once you have these unknown files, if you're going to be looking for a rootkit, you'll probably look for some executable code. So you're going to look for patterns, and every executable has a certain number of patterns. That you can, most of the Windows PE spec says, okay, they all start with the MZ signature, all the files. Although standard PE files will start with MZ. And for a while, Metasploit had a tool called transmogrify, which would alter that signature. So tools like Encase would incorrectly conclude that a file wasn't an executable because it didn't match that signature. So to attack the signature analysis phase, you have to modify the file. The question then it becomes, do you make a large modification, or do you make a small modification? Transmogrification seemed to rely on making small, tiny little modifications that wouldn't affect things too much, whereas steganography and encryption are kind of relying on big changes to kind of alter the signature of a file. So let's say they've found their unknown executable. It's passed through all those phases and they've spit out like this little set of unknown executables that are now suspicious. Okay, so what can they do? Well, the first thing they'll do is static analysis, which means they'll look at it without actually running it. They might dump the headers, they might disassemble, they might crank up a hex editor, and basically there have been countermeasures for this, but it all boils down to putting the executable in a format which is difficult to analyze. So in other words, I'm talking about compression, encryption, or recasting the executable in terms of arbitrary bytecode. And most of these techniques use the same basic methodology. In other words, you take the original application and you encrypt it, or you compress it, or you recast it as bytecode, and then you graft this stub code onto it, right? And this stub code replaces there's a new entry point in the stub code, so that when the executable gets launched, the stub code is launched instead. And with a packed executable, the stub code will decompress. And if it's a crypted executable, the stub code will decrypt at runtime. If the original executable has been recast as bytecode, this stub might actually be a virtual machine, and in which case it will just execute the bytecode. So one thing, this stub, the idea of this stub is it kind of is reminiscent of what's known as a userland exec. It's a way of taking a stream of bytes and putting it in memory and doing the fix-ups necessary so that it can execute. And this basically allows the program to sidestep normal loading procedures that the operating system would have to take care of. You're doing all the fix-ups yourself manually. You don't rely on any facilities that normally would be provided by the operating system. And we're going to see this later when I talk about memory resident rootkits. This will become like a crucial part. So this stub is kind of like an initial cut at a userland exec. So if you're using a cryptor, in other words, you've encrypted the code and that stub is going to be decrypting the executable at runtime, you have to worry about key management again. So if at all possible, you don't want to store the key in the stub or even in the body of the application. If you can do it, if all possible, keep the key outside of the stub. If you can't, then you've got to make the decryption process as expensive and elaborate as possible. Now, you might break up the encrypted executable into sections and use a different key for each part, and then generate these keys from seed values when the application starts. So another thing you should be aware of, Another thing you should be aware of is that if you're using standard tools like UPX, there are tools that will recognize that the compression algorithm and the format of the executable and the way the sections are all set up. So if at all possible, again, in the interest of buying time, write a custom tool to do it. And it's not an easy task, but it's doable, it's feasible. And if you're going to write a custom tool, you might as well use a combination of algorithms. Just don't pack. Just don't encrypt, just don't recast as bytecode. Use a combination of all. You could have a program which recasts the executable as bytecode and then compresses it and then encrypts it. And so when you're processing it at runtime, you've got to go through all those steps. So they can't just take a tool like PEID and figure out, okay, well this has been compressed by UPX. I can take UPX and unpack it and then look at it. You basically raise the bar, make it more difficult for them to process it statically and buy time. Now, one of the problems with these packers and cryptors and these things that will recast as bytecode is that they tend to all have like these characteristics. They don't leave a lot of string data in the executable, and they often mangle imports in the application. And there are also tools like Mandiant's Red Curtain, which will look for code entropy. So it will look at your code and say, that code looks like it's been encrypted or compressed, and it will say, I think this code is evil, and it will give you like a score. And so these are things you have to kind of be aware of, because you should assume they're going to be using these tools. So one thing you can do is you can salt the executable, the stub code, with all sorts of fake code to make it look to make it look more legitimate, to insert string data into it, to give it a more less recognizable structure, to have imports, to have all the things that might normally be missing if you were just using a standard packer or a cryptor. Or you can even go full bore and wrap it into a Trojan. And so, it's literally a part of maybe a resource inside of a legitimate application. So even if you write this custom tool to do packing, a combination of packing, encrypting, or whatever, there's always eventually what they're going to do is they're going to sidestep that by either running it in a general emulator, or they're just going to maybe have a sandbox environment, maybe a virtual machine and a dedicated network segment, and they might run it just to see, because eventually that stub will unpack or deprocess or do whatever, and then they'll have a memory image they can at least look at, right? So This leads us to runtime analysis, because ultimately, like I said, static analysis, the defenses are not necessarily perfect because they can always just, there are all sorts of emulators, and naturally there are anti-emulation tricks, but they can run it and start taking a look at it, and so that it leads very naturally into the domain of runtime analysis. Okay, so with runtime analysis, they can look at what the application is doing from the outside. They can look at resource monitors, like the sysinternals tools, and they can look at system event logs, and also the basic, what is this application doing from the outside? What effect is it having on the system around it? Or they can look at it from the inside. They can use API tracing. I know there was a presentation today by Nick Harbour about winning and reversing, where he had this API tracing stuff that he kind of included. So that's like a way to see what it's doing from the inside without necessarily having to crank open a debugger, but you can also, use a debugger too. That's a good way. And, there's also tools like Mandiant's Memorize, where you can start the application and then just basically parse through the process address space of an application to see everything that's there. And naturally also too, if you think there's going to be a communication on the wire, most rootkits do communicate with the outside somehow. You can do some sort of network monitoring to see what packets are going over the wire. So in a sense, the investigator has become like a cracker, and you, the rootkit designer, have gone on defense. The roles have basically reversed. Now they're trying to crack your software. They're doing all sorts of reversing attacks on you. And so you've got to fall back on tactics which would normally be used by white hats. So I'm talking about tamper-proofing, obfuscation, and autonomy. So tamper-proofing is all about detecting and responding to modification, right? And the reason that's important is usually when someone's using a debugger, sometimes they'll insert a breakpoint and that will modify the memory image of the process. Or they might be trying to disable or enable a feature, so they'll no-op something out. And so you want a way to kind of detect that they're doing that. You want to prevent it. Now there's APIs that will detect debugger, the presence of a debugger, but those are pretty easy to subvert. I wouldn't put too much faith in those. I put much more faith in checksums and basically scanning code and creating a signature, a checksum-based signature, and seeing if there's been some modification. If you're going to use this approach, if you're going to use the checksum-based approach, you don't want to use a centralized API, because what that allows them to do is it allows the investigator to say, okay, all that checksumming is occurring in this one place. All I've got to do is no-op it out, disable it, and I'm home free. So what you want to do is you want to spread out. You want to have redundant checksums, and you want to have them spread out throughout your entire application. And not only that, but you want the checksumming code to be interdependent, so that if they try to alter one check code, right, one checksum routine, that alteration gets detected by another checksum routine. And furthermore, you can have certain routines that periodically rewrite sensitive code, so that if something's been no-opt out, you'll have another routine say, oh, that's been, I'm going to rewrite this code just periodically in case it's been disabled. And finally, another thing you can do is to have decoy checksum routines. That's actually somewhere where you can give them the illusion that these are the checksum routines. Okay, go ahead and disable these. And the real checksum code is spread all over the place elsewhere. Once you've detected modification, you don't want to crash and burn. Like I said, this is a preemptive analysis. You don't want to tip them off as to where the checksumming code is, or where the response code is. Basically, you want to have a silent trigger, and so you want them to walk into the blast zone before the booby trap goes off. And the best way to do that, that I've kind of come across, is to leave subtle bugs in your code and have the integrity checksumming code correct those bugs, as long as they've detected no modification. If the program seems like if the integrity is intact, okay, let's go ahead and fix the problems. If something's wrong, then it doesn't fix the subtle bugs, and the program slowly goes to hell, right, and leaves them on a goose chase. So like I said, you don't want to crash and burn, because that's going to be a telltale sign. You want to lead them on a goose chase, and you want to do it slowly. So obfuscation, there's a couple ways to do obfuscation. You can do it at the source code level, which really will hurt maintainability, or you can do it at the machine code level, which is known as code morphing. While most obfuscation tactics are conceptually simple, if you use enough of them in concert with each other, it can buy you time. You know, it's sufficient enough that companies like Microsoft even use it. If you've ever read, there's a series of 3 articles in Uninformed about Microsoft's kernel code patch protection and the driver signing stuff and how to disable that. And what it comes down to is that Microsoft relies heavily on obfuscation and misdirection. And so those articles are a really good place to start if you want to see how, just how nasty things can get. In terms of obfuscation, there are tactics which basically seek to reduce code abstraction. In other words, you want to swamp the viewer with low-level details. And then there's other tactics which will increase complexity by moving code around, or by breaking well-known conventions, so that if you're reading the assembler, and most of the time you can recognize stack setups and function calls, and if you break those conventions, it makes it a little bit harder for them to reverse engineer the assembler. And finally, there's like even more extreme solutions like encrypting code, although I'm going to warn you, if you rely on code encryption, bear in mind that it's not a thread-safe solution. If you have multiple threads all trying to do stuff and they start encrypting and decrypting, they're going to interfere with each other, and it's not going to work. So that's just something to bear in mind. Then there's autonomy. This is actually, from the standpoint of a rootkit, this is a really powerful technique. Because, like I said about the system calls being like an OS commons, and it's basically like a well that both sides use. And if a rootkit is using system calls, it can be used against the rootkit because you can audit what the rootkit is doing by tracing system calls. By the same token, a rootkit can subvert an investigator by attacking the system calls that the tool uses. So if the investigator's, like I said, with a live disk imaging, it's using a certain set of system calls, and if you can subvert those, then you can hide yourself successfully. So basically, there have been a bunch of rootkits that have used this to one extent or another, like with the Athens affair. The rootkit that those technicians in Greece discovered had its own private database. Why did it have its own private database? Well, because by using its own version of the database, it didn't have to use the established one, and therefore it could avoid generating an audit trail. And then there's detour, which was, I believe, in 2006, was presented by Joanna Rutkowska. And it had its own TCP/IP stack, and its interface to the operating system was nothing more than a couple of double words that had been modified in the NDIS data section. I mean, other than that, it was completely standalone. It didn't use any of the official channels, and that making it much harder to detect. And then 2 years later, Sean Embleton and Sherry Sparks came out with detour, which was basically along the same idea. The difference is that this rootkit talked directly, it sidestepped the operating system entirely and the existing TCP/IP stack and talked directly to the hardware. So again, autonomy, not using official channels, not using the official facilities that the operating system provides as a way to detection. And finally, there's the blue pill, the idea behind a rogue hypervisor, where you're really evading, there's no sign of detection because you haven't modified anything within the operating system itself. You've migrated it into a virtual machine, and now you're completely outside of it. And that seems to be like a trend in general, with hypervisors and with hardware protected regions of memory. The vendors say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to protect ourselves from malware by creating these features where the operating system can't access these regions of memory. And that's great until somehow the malicious code finds its way out into these protected regions of memory. And now you have basically a rootkit, which the operating system has a much harder time detecting. Obviously, there have been defenses that have been developed against hypervisors, TLB profiling and that type of stuff. But it's a general trend. It's a powerful technique of taking yourself outside of the official channels. So data source elimination is a powerful enough technique that it kind of deserves its own special section. It's an anti-forensic technique, and the primary kind of instances of this strategy you'd find in memory-resident rootkits and firmware-based rootkits, because it's a way of avoiding the disk. So I knew an ex-con once who said the best way to outsmart the prison guards in prison is never to go to prison to begin with. And so you could kind of say the same thing about disk analysis. The forensic, the post-mortem process. The best way to sidestep that is never to end up on disk to begin with, right? Never go to disk. And so there's a bunch of ways to do that. There's syscall processing, there's memory-resident development tools. Way back when, the GRUG put out this framework that was pretty nifty called data contraception. I know that Metasploit, the Meterpreter, has used in-memory library injection, and most recently they've got a version of that that's going to be presented on Sunday, I think in DEF CON, called reflective DLL injection. And then there's also, you can also persist without actually persisting on disk through reinfection. So again, the idea of a userland exec kind of comes into play. So we had this stub code, and for the packers and the cryptors and the loaders, it's kind of a lightweight implementation. But what we need now is something a little more heavyweight. We need something. Most of the operating system facilities to load code assume disk residence. So we're in memory now. We can't load anything from disk, and we can't leave anything on disk. So we have to have our own loading mechanism. We have to implement our own, basically our own special own private version of a code loader. We've got to be able to load stuff into memory without using the operating system. So there's been work in that area. On the Windows 32 side, there was something called Nebet's Shuttle, which came out, and that was, I think, public. If you Google it, you'll find him. He's on Google Groups. He actually posts his source code, and that's like a good kind of first cut at a userland exec on Windows. On the Unix side of the fence, the GRUG put out a well-known FRAC article where he talks about this tool called remote exec, and he uses basically the GNU debugger and a custom library to do that. And there were some people who built upon that existing framework to make it a little easier to deploy. So syscall processing, that's a memory resident technique which is basically reminiscent of low-level RPC. So you have this application that's running, and it's running on the attacker's machine. But the system calls that it's making are occurring on the targeted remote system, so that you have this program that seems to be running on the attacker's machine from the attacker standpoint, but the byproducts of execution are happening on the targeted machine. And there have been well-known implementations of this. The Core Impact penetration testing tool from Core Security Technologies is probably the defining example of this technique. There are issues, obviously, and that is that the average application makes a ton of system calls. If you're looking at Procmon and you launch an application, you just see this like hundreds and hundreds of API calls. Yeah, so that translates into a lot of network communication between the client and server component, so to speak. And so it's kind of like, I see it as less than optimal because of that, because of all the excessive network chatter. It seems kind of conspicuous. Then there's memory resident development tools. This is an interesting idea. Okay, so in this case, the attacker's machine streams over source code to the targeted machine. And there's an in-memory compiler which compiles that code and dynamically, it'll compile it and then dynamically link it in memory. So you can send over source code, you can, and the memory SNE compiler will process it and then give you an executable that you can launch in memory. And there's interesting, things, there are variations on this. This is why I like the technique, because it's kind of like it can lead to other things. For example, you could include a memory resident virtual machine, and the compiler could be a bytecode compiler, so that you could stream across source code, and the compiler would generate bytecode, and that would be fed to the in-memory virtual machine. And that's useful because virtual machines, a lot of them support dynamic code, loading code dynamically, without necessarily having to be dependent upon a specific operating system, or the way that the application structure that is system specific. So you can kind of gain a little bit of freedom. Now there's data contraception, like I said before. This is a approach, a framework that was developed by the GRUG. And the idea is that to minimize the amount of forensic evidence you leave on a system, you use a common tool that's there on the targeted system that gives you access to its address space or the address space of another program. And that way, instead of having to establish this custom loading, this custom kind of user exec, you can use this common utility and do it without having to leave an artifact on the system, which might give you away. So the way he did it, his implementation used the GNU debugger and a custom library. But the downside of this technique is that this server, this server which is offering its address space or the address space of another app is kind of general. It's not very smart, and so the client has to kind of compensate for that and be really smart and make up for all that work. So you end up having to create this really elaborate client that will do most of the work, so that the server, which is basically a general utility, it can't do much other than what it's designed to do, and it wasn't designed to be a userland exec, just to offer some basic services. So the server ends up being dumb, the client ends up being smart, and so you end up having to put all this work into the client. Then there's in-memory library injection. Again, the existing version of the metinterpreter uses this technique, and the original implementation was they took the system calls that load DLLs in the operating system and they hooked them. And they did this so that, instead of being constrained by the fact you have to load DLL from disk, by hooking them, they could manipulate the process so they could load a DLL from memory. Now, this was kind of, again, a nice suite technically from an engineering standpoint, because you didn't have to re-implement that much. You could use the existing APIs to load code. And that's also the weakness of the technique, is you're using existing APIs to load a DLL. So what you'd have is this DLL in memory that's there, that's abiding by all the bookkeeping necessities. And so if you scan through memory, you'll find this DLL. And if you look on disk and you don't see it, well, that's kind of a telltale sign. Not to mention that, again, API tracing can come into play. And you can tell that this thing is loading a DLL. It's calling these APIs. Even if they're not loading a DLL on disk, they're being invoked. And they recently changed that. On Sunday, like I said, HD is going to present an updated version of the metinterpreter that uses something called reflective DLL injection, which literally ships with its own userland exec. So instead of having to call the existing system calls and wrapping them, it has its own private loader, which will take the DLLs and load them into memory. So it doesn't have to rely on any system calls. One way you can have your cake and eat it too is persisting by reinfection. In other words, your program your rootkit sends out a heartbeat, right? And this heartbeat, you can use a passive covert channel, so you don't have to generate any new network traffic. You might be able to embed your heartbeat within an existing network packet and just have the server which is passively listening to this. And so you have this heartbeat monitor, which is accepting this signal, which could be, again, passively embedded. And if it detects that this signal is stopped, this heartbeat stopped, usually it could be because the system's rebooted itself, or it's gone down or been shut down. And so upon detecting that, this heartbeat monitor can then reinstall the rootkit through a zero-day exploit or some other means. So it's a way of persisting and staying memory resident without necessarily having to reside on disk. And again, this is an idea that was presented by Jona Rutkowska at a previous Black Hat. So firmware-based rootkits. There's been a lot of work in this area recently. Like if you went to the show this morning, the Invisible Things Lab talked about rootkits with Intel's BIOS. So there's been work publicly available that you can look at. It's good because it's still not a standard place, and it's inspecting the BIOS and dumping it and doing analysis of it isn't necessarily part of the standard process that people even think about doing. So it's worth looking at because it's just another way of avoiding the disk. So like I said, there's been public work on this, but there's also been proprietary commercial work on it. There's a company called Absolute Software which sells inventory tracking product called CompuTrace. And this product has a persistent agent which they've worked with OEMs to provide hardware level support for. So this persistent agent resides in the BIOS. So the idea is, okay, someone steals your laptop and they wipe the hard drive. Okay, fine. The minute they start the machine up, the BIOS is going to recognize that the drive has been wiped and it's going to reinstall the CompuTrace application on disk as a way to kind of survive. And naturally, they had the advantage of working with OEMs, so they have they have all the information they need. And trying to do something like this on your own, you face a whole series of challenges of not having access to information that you need and stuff being undocumented. And if you sat in on the lecture this morning about hacking Intel BIOS, they talked about how much work it was to reverse engineer stuff. So that's kind of like it's a difficult route to take, and only if you really had the motivation, so to speak, as a rootkit designer, would I advise taking this route. On the other hand, there's nothing preventing you from leveraging the work that Absolute has done, and I wonder how long it's going to take until someone finds a way to commandeer CompuTrace and hijack it and use it for their own purposes. It's just like any security software, and they're like the Sony Rootkit. Sony put it out there so that they could prevent copyright infringement, but then the people started using it for their own purposes. And I wouldn't be surprised if the same thing happened with this BIOS embedded CompuTrace stuff. If someone finds a way to hijack it. So now let's go on to some logistical issues. Ultimately, there's this tension between minimizing footprint and surviving a reboot. If you stay memory resident, you're not going to be able to survive reboot for the most part. The machine turns off and you vanish, poof. On the other hand, if you decide, okay, my goal is to survive a restart, you're going to end up on disk, and that provides ammunition for the investigator. So, if you have the money and the resources, you might be able to solve that problem and have the best of both worlds. But even rootkit designers have a budget, just like the investigator. And so oftentimes you have to make compromises. So you end up having to err on one side or the other. And so if you remember, I kind of talked about this at the beginning. You have to strike a balance, and it's all based on the environment you're targeting with your rootkit, the value of the data that you're seeking, and the type of person that you're up against, right? So we assumed in the beginning that we were, going up against a knowledgeable, well-armed adversary. So if I had to give you like a preferred attack vector, I would say, okay, this is what I would do. I would attack through an exploit. install my rootkit that way, allow it to stay memory resident. And this way I avoid touching the disk and I avoid creating any new processes, right? You stay within the context of an existing process. Now, if that's not feasible for whatever reason, fine, okay. Another approach would be to maybe load an agent into the BIOS, modify the firmware somehow, so that when you reboot, this agent will load and then receive the primary part of the rootkit over a network connection and then load that into memory. The problem with that kind of approach is you might avoid the disk, but now you've created a new process. So someone who's using something like Mandiant's Memorize, or someone who's got a kernel debugger loaded up and is watching things happen, will see that you've created this new process and one which doesn't necessarily belong. And if that's too much work, then the least attractive vector is, okay, persist on disk and use all the other strategies: data destruction, data concealment, data transformation, data fabrication. And if you leverage enough of these and you buy enough time, it still might be enough. Keep in mind that the code that launches your rootkit is going to be naked, right? You've got to launch that rootkit somehow. And so it's got to be in a place that it's accessible to the operating system, and it's going to be unencrypted, it's going to be naked. So that's like an issue you have to deal with. And if you can, I would suggest configuring, using, if you have to take that approach, use the kind of the data contraception approaches where you're using a common existing utility. That way the naked code that's getting executed is already a known quantity. It's not necessarily something you introduced. So what's the bottom line? I think with all the memory resident stuff that's going out with like the Metasploit Meterpreter, it kind of has brought in a new paradigm. And for the most part, I think that disk analysis, the question posed by a post-mortem autopsy of disk storage is a question that has pretty much been solved. It's been addressed sufficiently. A lot of servers never go down. They're up for weeks at a time, and sometimes that's easily enough. You just need to get in, get your data, and then get out. And so I think that I see the battlefront moving as a result to live incident response and to network security monitoring. I think these are the new frontiers, so to speak. I think that the days where people would just bust out in case and do some Nintendo forensics are over. It's come back down to memory analysis and to looking at packets on the network. And if you look at the trainings that occurred over the past few days, you'll see that there's definitely an emphasis now on analyzing memory, and you'll see these companies come out with tools to analyze memory, like Memorize or Red Curtain or HP Gary's Responder. So the trend now is moving out to these new areas. And the problem is you kind of move back into the caveat is now that it's like an arms race, because these rootkits can defend themselves. They're in memory and they can interfere with the process. So it's kind of like it's come back to the initial quandary, and it's now kind of a cockfight in memory between the two sides. And so it should keep things pretty interesting for the next few years, or at least until there are like some pivotal architectural changes by one of the software vendors. Like maybe Microsoft will adopt a multi-ring kernel mode protection architecture. Who knows? So if you're interested in this topic and any other topics, I've written a book that kind of goes into some of this stuff in a little more detail. I've tried to give you an overview. I figure if I start going into heavily technical stuff, I'd probably put some of you to sleep. So I've tried to give you an overview and kind of a taste. Any questions? This is your opportunity to provoke me to think more deeply about my subject material. Yeah, shoot. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you know if that depends on the server was running exception tests in order to load up virus building or something? Because I'm wondering, will that be controlled data if there's a PCO or HPA on there? Or will that server have a PCO?
Oh, that's a good question. I wish I had the answer. If I worked for guidance software, I probably would have the answer. I mean, I know that the current, like, if you're working locally and you've got, you've got your encase and you've got your write blocker and everything else, you should easily have access. I don't know exactly the nuances of doing it over the network with an agent. Yeah, that's a good question. Oh, I'm sorry. It had to do with using encase with a remote agent and doing the live disk imaging that way. Am I correct in the? Yeah, over the network. So, sorry about that. Oh, well, he was asking, encase has got an agent where you can remotely do live imaging, and in that way, rather than having to be at the machine, you can just stream the data over. And then he was asking, okay, can you capture? Are there any issues in terms of capturing HPA and DCO? Is that the question?
Yeah, the server of the agent that runs on
Yeah.
the machine.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on OS call, BIOS calls, whatever. So if the underlying OS, BIOS, whatever it is recording it, it says it's not seeing HPA or DCO.
Mm-hmm.
That servlet won't automatically.
Yeah, I don't know. If you want to talk about it more, come on up after the presentation. Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions? Shoot.
That guided slide doesn't have as much time and money as you think.
You think so? Oh, geez, that's tough.
Unless you can talk about loss, that would be.
All right. Send me his email. I'll see what I can do. Yeah, shoot.
Thanks for the book, and how long did it take you to research?
You should ask my wife that question. Here. This took me about 2 years. So, yeah. My own experience, I started back, I was an IT grunt. I got hired by San Francisco State University, and I walked into this war zone. We owned a bunch of subnets in the Class B range. We still own these subnets in the Class B range, and there wasn't a firewall or anything. There was not even a NAT device protecting us. And so we have all these machines out in the open. And that was really my introduction, because we definitely got rooted. In fact, at one point they got our domain controllers, and what they did then, they didn't destroy any data, but man, they had a lot of fun. Once they had our domain controllers, they took one of our web servers and made it into a SUS server, the software update services, which was Microsoft's kind of way of doing localized updates. So if you have a weak WAN link, you can download updates to one machine over the WAN, which is the SUS server, and then distribute those locally over the LAN, right? The problem with that is that, your clients are all pointed to the SUS server through group policy. So the group policy points all these machines to the SUS server, and it becomes a single point of failure. So what they did was they installed the SUS server, and all our clients were pointed to this machine, and downloading the malware that they'd installed for distribution through the SUS server. So we had Dameware installed. Well, Dameware is not necessarily malware, but it's a remote access program, and they installed it on all of our machines. And it took us about 2 years to clean it up. And we ran into Hacker Defender. We ran into all sorts of weird, off-brand stuff. And so this was really my introduction to it, I'd say starting back in around 2004, 2005. And it kind of blossomed into an interest, and I started doing research, and one thing led to another, and then I was like, I've done so much work on this, I might as well just, archive this so I have some sort of, something, to represent all the homework that I've done. So I'd say roughly 2 years. It took about a year and a half to research, and then another year to write. So, to go through the whole publishing process, and to do, to update the material as I needed, because obviously during this whole process, the field isn't static, things are changing. So, yeah, it was a lot of fun. I had a good time. I mean, believe it or not, I've already started working on the second edition. I mean, things change so rapidly that a lot of stuff in this book, like the reflective DLL injection and all the biospace rootkit stuff and SMM rootkits, which have recently become more prominent, and all the hypervisor stuff, which is when I was in the process of writing the book, it wasn't as active, and it didn't seem as much of a threat. It seemed more like a theoretical threat rather than like a practical threat. And I'll definitely want to look into that more and a little more deeply. It's an interesting area, yeah. Go for it, shoot.
Carrier and Grant have a patent on imaging over firewire.
Ooh. Carrier and Grant have a patent regarding imaging over firewire. Imaging disk?
It's over PCI.
Oh, imaging memory, right. Okay, I see what you're saying. Capturing RAM-based memory capturing over PCI. Well, like I said, the result that Rutkowska kind of showed was that you can manipulate related elements on the motherboard with software at runtime and affect the process. Obviously, her solution was really hardware specific. I mean, a lot of her stuff recently, it's been really like drilling down into one particular platform, one particular chipset. And so the investment is significant, as you can see from their effort. I mean, these three people are just spending all their time, they devoted almost 100% to finding the little magic numbers and the code and everything else that will do this. So I don't know, I think there's something to hardware-based RAM capture, but I haven't seen, ever since Komoku was bought by Microsoft, I haven't seen any like commercial product like being put out there. And that kind of makes me a little nervous as to, is it feasible, or are there hurdles I don't know about that are in place? So, until I see like a product that's being sold and they're saying, you can reliably capture your RAM with this product, until that happens, I'm gonna, kind of withhold judgment, or at least be a little skeptical. I think for the time being, we're stuck with software-based tools like Memorize or the HP Gary Responder or stuff like that. Really?
That's something done for agents, like Metal Storm did his presentation ages ago.
Mm-hmm.
Without owning through FireWire,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
DNA.
Mm-hmm.
There's been lots more stuff on there.
I know there was a proof of concept with that, but I never knew that it was a commercial product.
But he did live demonstrations of it. It's just like what your iPod would do.
Mm-hmm.
Full rewrite access to memory.
Mm-hmm.
The post, and you get execution for that as well.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
Also, the join it is what you're talking about.
Right. It's
Full mode processing cut down anyway.
right.
At the time when you did it 12, they were just going out until this 2007.
Right.
So anything since then, as I you can't match.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's pretty easy. It's just setting some multi-sync registers.
It's just what?
Multi-sync registers.
Mm-hmm.
They basically say, I want
Right.
between this, like X
Mm-hmm.
and Y, speed, not it matters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Thank you. I have to look into that. Yes. I've only looked at like the big vendors. I know that Memorize. I think one of the tools you can put on a USB, like with a U3, and just run. Great. I mean, I think that, like I said, the tendency is to move away from relying on system calls. The thing that I was impressed with Memorize is that it's parsing memory manually. It's not necessarily using system calls to do what it does. And like I said, it all comes to autonomy. Those operating system calls are like the commons, like the OS commons, right? And you can poison the well that everyone drinks from, right? So any tool that's using them can be undermined if the rootkit is doing something to them, hooking them or whatever. By the same token, the rootkit can be detected if it's using them, right, through API tracing or whatever. If it's using system resources, it can, you can run it in a virtual machine or in an emulator and find out what it's doing that way. So by going towards autonomy, by parsing memory rather than relying on API calls to get it, like a kernel dump might do, I think that's a much safer and much more impressive approach. And I think it's much more of a solid kind of strategy for the long term. I think you don't want to rely on the operating system to do stuff for you. The less you rely on it, whether you're an attacker or a defender, the better off you are.
What about volatility guarantees? Memorize?
Oh, okay. Ooh.
Maybe something like the mouth quiet function, like the old has, I think that's much better.
Yeah, I don't want to get into that kind of making a comment like that, but I mean, the volatility framework seems pretty flexible and fairly general purpose, as opposed to being just a specific tool for a specific thing. It seems like you can do a whole lot more with it. But in terms of saying, I don't want to necessarily side, straddling here. So you put me in an awkward situation. All right, thanks. Any other questions? Well, like I said, I wrote a book, and pick it up. I have a couple of free copies. If anyone wants one, just come up and get it. And thank you very much for your time.